My very first truly appointed leadership position would have been in basic training. I was all of 19 years old. I was in a group of 40 other guys. And on day 9, the guy who had been appointed our dorm chief on day 1 said or did something stupid. I can't even remember what it was. But we had 2 drill instructors, both female. And one of them looked at him and said, "You're fired. You may even get recycled," which means to start the whole basic training over again. Sent him to the back of the line and randomly pointed at me and said, "You're the dorm chief." I'm like, what even does that mean? Well, in basic training, the Air Force dorm chief, the flight chief, is the person responsible for that group of guys until they graduate. Unless, of course, you do like he did and got in trouble and got taken out of that position. Well, I served as the dorm chief all the way up to the day before graduation. And I still can't remember exactly what kind of flimsy excuse it was. I think it was we used the wrong color of paint on the eyeballs of the mural that we painted on the wall. Something like that. It was really kind of a just ridiculous kind of disappointment. But the appointment to the position of dorm chief came as a surprise to me. I wasn't expecting it. I didn't know that it was going to happen. It was an assignment that I was given. And it came with some responsibility, especially since we had female drill sergeants. Because the female couldn't be in the dorm between the time the sun went down and the time the sun came up. By law, in that day, I don't know what it is now. What that meant was any of those random midnight inspections, those jump out of bed type of things, we were never prepared for those by our drill instructors because they were never around. But it also meant that we were under a higher level of scrutiny because the drill instructors that would come in and do that were having to do it for their flight as well as for our flight. So they were already a little bit perturbed. And because they were doing it for someone else, they had no recourse whatsoever. There was nothing we could say to appeal or anything. If they came through and your bed sheet wasn't tight enough, you got in trouble. If they came through and your shoes weren't in a straight line, you got in trouble. If they came through and snapped a chalk line down the end of the beds and they weren't in straight lines after you've been sleeping in them all night, you were in trouble. If they pulled a toothpaste tube out and there was toothpaste in the cap, you got in trouble. And for every one of those demerits, you may have to run a mile, you may have to work kitchen duty, you may have to pick up trash on the side of the road. You had no idea what the punishment was going to be, and it could be as random and as drastic as they wanted it to be, and there was no recourse and no appeal. So part of my job as the dorm chief was to keep that group of guys in line, to teach them how to march, to instruct them how to march, to practice marching with them. All of these things, even after hours. So when the sun went down in September, also meant that actually we started on September the 30th, so going into October. Those evenings sometimes would come a little early. The sun would go down, we would go to chow hall, and by the time we came back, we had no drill instructor. So I was responsible for everything that they had to do, studying their homework, to pass the test, to be able to do the written exams, to be ready to fire, all of that stuff. I kind of became their interim drill instructor when the rest of the team, when the real drill instructors were gone. And that was a lot of pressure because here I was at 19 years old, some guys younger than me, not by much, a lot of guys older than me. Some had already been prior military and other outfits. Some were ROTC or had been to college, but they still had to go to the first 9 days or first 12 days of basic training. And so the journey was a real mixed bag of people. At that time, I have to be honest and say I didn't even see it as leadership. I didn't know what the word leadership meant. It was only a couple of years after that when I had the argument with the first sergeant when I got to my training base that I surrendered my rope as a leader. That's when I read Becoming a Person of Influence by John Maxwell. That was when my fascination and study of everything John Maxwell began. So that's been over 25 years now. But that dorm chief assignment as an appointment, I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea. I knew I had a little influence. I knew I had a little authority. I knew I had a lot of responsibility, but I had no idea what I was doing or how I was going to get it done. Thankfully, God's given me a gift of persuasion. And so my ability to get them to come on board with me to do things my way seemed to come naturally. And it worked really well for the next 21 days as dorm chief. And we had a good time. We graduated as an honor flight. We scored all the points that we possibly could. And everything worked out well for us. That's not always the case with appointments to leadership. Sometimes people get appointed as a favor because someone else owes them something. Or sometimes people get appointed because they manipulate their way into the system to become a leader. And because they've manipulated their way into the system, they may not have the skill set. They may not have the natural talents. They may not have the character that's necessary to lead. Now, I led that dorm group, that flight of 30 or 40 men for those 21 days without a whole lot of hiccups or a whole lot of trouble. Very few arguments, no real fights, and everything seemed to work pretty well. But they were already a submitted group because we were in basic training. If I had moved on to more extensive leadership with the skill set I had then, I would have been in trouble because I was way in over my head for leading a large group of people in an entirely different way. I look back now and I realize how many skills I didn't have that I needed. But the one thing that is a unique reality is that leaders who have surrendered themselves to God, leaders who are willing to submit and say, I don't know what I don't know. I don't know what I need to learn next. I don't know where to find the information. So I'm just going to wait and ask God to fill in the blanks for me. That kind of leader is an entirely different leader. That kind of leader is not all book smarts. It's not all street smarts. And sometimes their advice comes from a place that no one else understands or recognizes. A godly leader often has heavenly advice that the world doesn't recognize at all. It doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't seem to go with the flow. It doesn't seem to fit the status quo. Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader like that. Martin Luther was a leader like that. Winston Churchill may have been a leader like that. Some of the things he said didn't seem very divinely inspired, but some of his strategies and his tactics were otherworldly. And as we look through the decades and centuries of leadership, not only in America but around the world, we see leaders who have submitted themselves to the local authorities. We see leaders who have submitted themselves to heavenly authorities or to regime authorities. Let me give you this one example that really strikes me. It's one of my favorite life verses. I believe it's in Mark 24:10. Forgive me, I'd have to look it up again. But the verse is very powerful. The verse is also really simple. I mean, really simple. It says this: "You have no authority over me except that which my Father has given you." Now, those words were spoken by Jesus. And so as we put them in the context of saying, you have no authority over me except what my Father has given you, and then we realize that's Jesus, we go, well, duh. I mean, if God didn't give them authority, then they don't really have any authority, and God's not going to give anybody authority over his own son unless he trusts them, right? But who did he say it to? See, who he said it to it puts that whole thing in a very powerful context. When you realize that the who he said it to at that time served under Caesar, and Caesar basically saw himself as God. So in this confrontation, Pontius Pilate serving under Caesar and Jesus Christ serving under God both saw themselves as a son or servant of the Almighty. Think about that clash for a moment. Caesar ruled the world as if he was the God of the world. Pontius Pilate served under Caesar. Jesus served God, who did create and rule the world, as though he served the one who ruled the world. And when we start putting all those things in context, we realize how vehemently opposed to each other they would have been. As they stood there and Pontius Pilate looked Jesus in the face and he said, "Listen, don't you understand who I am? Do you get it? I am anointed, I am appointed, I am assigned here by Caesar, the largest army on the face of the earth, the ruling kingdom of the globe. No one holds more authority in your life right now than me. And I have the right to crucify you or set you free. It's at my word. My will be your destiny. And of all of the things that had been said to Jesus all day, all the things he'd been accused of, all the things he'd been beaten for, whipped for, had the crown of thorns shoved on his head for, the one thing he responded to was that statement. He was silent until that moment. And when Pontius Pilate, the servant of Caesar, said, "Don't you understand that I have the right, the power, the authority to crucify you or to set you free?" Jesus replied simply with, "You have no authority over me, except what my Father has already given you." And in that moment, Pontius Pilate must have been taken back a little bit, going, wait, so all the authority of Rome, all the authority of Caesar, you're telling me you have more power than that? You have more authority than that? And his wife had already warned him not to have anything to do with this Jesus character. She'd heard way too much stuff about this young man. But see, that anointed and appointed authority that came on Christ from God the Father was an entirely different anointed and appointed authority than came on Pontius Pilate from Caesar. It's a whole different ball game when what you're surrendered to and submitted to can only go so far. Now, the text on the screen today has to do with what does it mean to be a leader under authority appointed by God? And these are the last words, according to the book of Samuel, these are the last words of King David. And he said, these are the last words of David, the voice of the son of Jesse, the voice of the man God took to the top, whom the God of Jacob made king and Israel's most popular singer. Now let's stop right there for just a moment and ask the question, how many people have had that Frank Sinatra way of looking at life and going, I did it my way, right? They're thoroughly convinced that they are self-made men. They have reached their level of success, their level of achievement, their level of accomplishment by the work of their own brow, by the grit, by their power, by their force, by their manipulation, by their spending of money, by their cajoling of people. But this paragraph says, the voice of the son of Jesse, the voice of the man God took to the top, whom God of Jacob made king, and whom the God of Jacob made Israel's most popular singer. David's fame throughout the land of Israel wasn't David's work. David's ruling as king wasn't David's work. It wasn't David's political prowess that made him king. It wasn't his ability to rule and reign and slay. No, those aren't what made him king. If you go back and read the backstory, you'll remember that David was anointed and appointed as king as a boy. God knew who David was going to be as a man growing up. God knew about his failures. God knew about his weaknesses. God knew about his need for God. And yet God chose him and then set him on a path of destiny to become Israel's most popular singer, a warrior, a mighty man of valor, and the king, one of the most powerful kings of all time. God's Spirit spoke through me, says David. His words took shape on my tongue. The God of Israel spoke to me. Israel's rock mountain said, whoever governs fairly and well, who rules in the fear of God, is like the first light at daybreak, without a cloud in the sky, like green grass carpeting the earth, glistening under fresh rain. And this is just how my regime has been, for God guaranteed his covenant with me, spelled it out plainly, and kept every promised word, my entire salvation, my entire desire. But the devil's henchmen are like thorns, culled and piled as trash. Better not try to touch them. Keep your distance with a rake or a hoe. They'll make a great, glorious bonfire. There are a couple of things that I want to point out there. And one of them is that David realized that the words that he spoke needed to be the words of God. That God would shape those words on his tongue before they were released into the universe. That God Almighty would craft every sentence if David would surrender. He says, the God of Israel spoke to me. Israel's rock mountain said, whoever governs fairly and well, who rules in the fear of God, is like the first light at daybreak without a cloud in the sky, like green grass carpeting the earth, glistening under a fresh rain. How's that for a description of a God-centered leader? What's it like to live under authority and leadership and rulership of someone who fears God? It's like the first light at daybreak on a cloudless day. It's like the glistening of the green grass after a fresh rain. That's what life is supposed to be like on this earth when our leaders are surrendered to God. Not Pontius Pilate surrendered to Caesar. Not men of power surrendered to power and manipulation. Not men and women of power surrendered to the gaining of wealth, or the manipulating of people, or the dividing of people, or the classes of people. And it happens all over the world, in nations all over the world. One of the challenges we encountered in the Congo, speaking to government leaders there, was that so many people get that appointment or that assignment to be in leadership and instantly begin to use it to gain wealth. They forget all about the promises they made to their neighbors when they were just Joe next door. Now they're the governor or the senator. And in that position, they have the ability to gain wealth. And they use that position like a little crowbar to dig up wealth, to store up wealth. And they forget about the people that they made promises to. They forget about the people that they were going to help. That's not like the fresh sunlight at daybreak with a cloudless sky. That's not like the green grass glistening after a fresh rain. That's like the cactus. In fact, David says they're like the henchmen of the devil. They're thorns, culled and piled up. See, there are a lot of people who want to lead by tyranny. They want to lead by hook and crook. They want to lead for their own gain. They want to lead because it makes them wealthy and powerful, because their ego feels good when they're in charge. Not because they're appointed by God. Not because they're anointed to do what they do and they have the gifts and the skills and the talents to do it. But because they found an inroad to gaining more power and influence. That's not what we're supposed to have for leaders. That's not who we're supposed to surrender to. That's not who we're supposed to submit to. But we do know that every authority has been allowed by God, and some of them will be there for the sole purpose of God bringing them down. God will allow them to rule and to reign, to lead, to hold power, to build wealth, so he can crush them. Because ultimately, when we look at the whole world of politics, the centuries and centuries of human existence, we look at the rise and fall of kingdoms like Rome and Great Europe and Great Britain, how they at one time were the rulers of all of the earth. And as that fragments and it falls apart, and then other superpowers rise and fall. In the end, it's all about one thing: God and his relationship to his children, his individual children. One person, you, one person, me, in relationship with God. That's what it's about. The journey of politics and economic cycles, the wars and rumors of wars, the earthquakes and the human destruction. It's a battle, a cosmic battle going on between God and his enemy who wants to keep God's children away from him. Godly leaders lead men back to God. Godly leaders surrender themselves to God to hear, what do you want me to do next? How do you want me to say these words? What would you like me to do in the next move? God, I need your voice. I need your thoughts. I need your ideas. I need your strategy. I need your tactics. I can't do this alone. And at every turn, in front of every political appointment, in front of every political opportunity, and every assignment, we have to remember what Jesus told Pontius Pilate. You have no authority over me except that which my Father has given you. And we've got to see that from both sides. If Pontius Pilate had authority over Jesus, it was because the Father gave it to him. How foolish of Jesus to revolt against that authority. How silly for Jesus to rebel against that authority. That authority had been given to Pontius Pilate by God Almighty so that the crucifixion might take place, so that Jesus could die on the cross, so that he could be raised from the dead. Had Jesus rebelled against the authority of Pontius Pilate, the one appointed over him, a cruel leader, a godless leader, a man who didn't know the Spirit of God, if Jesus hadn't submitted himself to that leadership, the cross may never have been. Salvation may never have come to mankind. We have to surrender to the authority God has appointed over us, whether we like them or we don't, whether we agree with them or we don't. We have to trust that the Almighty has this. I got this. And that he's big enough to handle it. And then in the end game, in the long game, he is in control and he is going to make happen what he intends to happen. 2 Peter 3:9 says he is not slack. He's not slow. He's not unwilling to keep his promises. He's patient, not willing that any should perish. Now, I don't know where you are in that cycle today. Are you a leader who has the opportunity, the right, and the authority to influence others? Then you have a responsibility to connect with the Almighty, to hear his voice and follow his instructions. Are you a servant of a leader who doesn't seem to be listening to God? Then pray that he would hear, or she would hear, the voice of God. Pray that they would begin to have an encounter with God that would feed them information. Like David said, God's Spirit spoke through me. His words took shape on my tongue. The God of Israel spoke to me. Israel's rock mountain said. We need to pray that our leaders, male and female, the boss at work to the leaders of our nations, would surrender themselves to an almighty God and hear the words of the King to lead fairly. Whoever governs fairly and well, who rules in the fear of God, is like the first light at daybreak. Will you be the first light at daybreak? Will you pray for the leaders around you to be the first light at daybreak, the fresh green grass covering the earth after a rain? Or will you be the rebellious one who denies the will of God, who thwarts the work of God? Now, there was a word that I said early on that a lot of people may have missed or overlooked. I want to bring it out for a second because I believe it's a powerful word. It's a powerful understanding of a prefix in front of a word. See, we often suffer frustrations in life. We don't get what we want. We feel like life has cheated us or taken something from us. And we have a word for that. We call it disappointment. And we've all been disappointed at some time. We've all been irritated with the outcome, frustrated with the results. We've tried so hard and to no avail. And we're disappointed, and that's understandable. But have you ever thought about that word in relationship to appointment? If it is appointed for every man once to die and then to face the judgment. If you're appointed to a job or a role, if you're appointed with a certain level of authority to accomplish a thing, and then disappointed. Just something to think about. I'm J Loren Norris, and you've been watching Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.